welcome to you all. We're so happy that so many of you could join us. And I'm Mariana Mazzucato. I'm the director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And we're super happy tonight to bring you the fourth event in our new series called Who Owns What and Why. We call it Wow Wow, nice to pronounce. And it's really been a thought-provoking series, and we have a couple events coming up, one also with Mark Carney looking at the green economy, and there as well, who owns what and why, who's investing, who's not. And this series has been exploring the idea of ownership and how it's actually structured in modern capitalism, but very much nested within a new understanding, we hope, of where value actually comes from in the first place, and really trying to also distinguish something that I try to do a deep dive in my book on value, the distinction between value creation and value extraction. And we're very thankful to the Omidyar Network, not only for funding the series itself, but also some of the underlying research. And Tim, who I'm going to introduce in a minute, is part of a new grant that we have with myself, Josh Ryan Collins, and some others, looking at how can we actually analyze, but also map and govern modern, what we call algorithmic rents. Using the word rent seeking and kind of modern day feudalism, hence the title today, digital feudalism, and that need to really differentiate at the business model level, but also at the governance model level in terms of public policy, how we can actually govern innovation and production for the common good and not just private profit, but very much, again, trying to analyze it in terms of how we understand value creation itself. And today's talk is going to be doing a deep analysis of this with two wonderful speakers, who again, I'll introduce in a minute. And really the reason we think it's so important is that even, under the COVID crisis, big tech has reaped massive rewards from global digital platforms, gaining a collective something like 2.7 trillion just during the pandemic. And so far from simply being large players and having to look at it through the lens of monopoly and kind of an antitrust lens, the idea is how can we actually understand modern digital platforms in terms of how they're structured, or how they're unstructured and unregulated, or how can we regulate them better, but also how can we, again, produce the platforms themselves, not just regulate them in a different way, and really looking at all the different collective players. And that means obviously the technology companies themselves, public actors who are not just responsible for regulating, but often for doing much of the underlying investment in the first place. Where did the internet come from? Public investment. But also really trying to understand it all through a shaping, a co-creation lens. So we're not always kind of on the back seat trying to pick up the mess afterwards, worried about taxation and privacy, all these really important issues. But how can we also look at it from a pre-distribution lens in terms of how we actually produce and innovate inside the sector? So if you want to follow the conversation on Twitter, please use the hashtag. I've been asked to tell you this, hashtag IIPP wow wow, and you can send questions and comments using the Q&A icon. And we have Nye and Josh, who are two PhD students with IIPP, who will be fielding us questions, or me questions at the end. Unfortunately, in advance, apologies, we cannot answer everyone's questions. So now it's a huge pleasure to introduce to you our speakers, and I dare to say also my friends. First, Shoshana Zuboff, who's the Charles Edward Wilson Professor Emerita at Harvard Business School. She's a fantastic and inspirational writer. Even my kids know who she is. So she's a scholar, a writer, an activist. That's why the kids know her. An author of 3 major books, each of which has signaled the start really of a new epoch in technological society, but really in kind of, again, modern capitalism and trying to understand that. And her recent masterwork that I have here somewhere, it's so thick it actually fell on my toe before and it's still hurting, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It's been hailed as the tech industry's silent spring and the Das Kapital of the 21st century. Amazing. And she also spoke at a wonderful big keynote lecture hall full of people when we could actually meet once upon a time at UCL. So we're incredibly grateful for her coming twice. Tim O'Reilly is, again, a friend, a wonderful scholar, an activist, and very much a practitioner. He's the founder, CEO, and chairman of O'Reilly Media, which I think, Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, started by actually making the manuals of computer manuals, the first computer manuals that people use to actually know how to program. And this company is one that's been providing the picks and shovels of learning, in fact, to Silicon Valley gold rush for the past 35 years. And many of my friends out there call him the muse of Silicon Valley. And he's also, I'm really happy to say, a visiting professor of practice at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And Tim has really been central in framing the big ideas behind open source software. I think actually that's a word you helped coin, as well as Web 2.0 and the WTF economy. And the F there is not the swear word, but the title of his new book. So what, I was going to say the bad word. Anyway, WTF ? What's the future and why it's up to us? And he's currently working on an exciting new book. And as I said, on a wonderful project with the Institute on Modern Algorithmic Rents. So what I'd love to do is to first kind of ask you guys to set the scene a bit. So in the spirit of what I just said, we can't keep picking up the mess afterwards. And in order to really understand what's going wrong, it's important to have an analysis of what the problem is. So if we can just first talk about the problem that we currently see in digital platforms, but very much through your lens. And I think you both have two different lenses, but they're quite symbiotic or synergetic, I should say. So maybe I'll start with Tim, also with the work that you're doing with myself and some others in the Institute. If you can just kind of step back and give us a sense in terms of your overview of where the key problems are at the heart of what we're seeing around big tech and why we can't just kind of look at it through a classic antitrust lens, but need to understand what's actually happening at the business model level.
Yeah, I think the very first starting point is with your book, The Value of Everything, because for me, the central question of economics is who gets what and why. And in traditional economics, we tell a story of free markets. And one of the things that you taught me was that one of the key distortions in free markets are rents, which are sort of the excess profits that are really derived through power imbalances. I mean, there are other types of rents, but that's a particular kind that we're concerned about, particularly with a title like digital feudalism. And so the question that I look at in my work has been, over the last 2 decades, I've been looking at the way that there was this movement where the internet brought us these new algorithmic superpowers where we were able to allocate value better. If you look at Google, their breakthrough in using the collective intelligence of all the users to come up with the best results. Amazon also used to basically use the collective intelligence of all their users to say, this really is the best product for your search. And then somewhere in the last decade, they turned away from that, fundamental innovation and began to use their algorithms to reward themselves disproportionately. And and to really turn into this stage where we see Google, which used to send traffic to other sites on the web, increasingly sends the traffic to itself. Amazon, which has built this enormous marketplace, which has made it possible for small merchants, large merchants to reach customers, but has increasingly extracted a tax on them. Their advertising business is a zero-sum advertising business, which basically is, hey, compete for attention. We have a small window. If you want to be at the top, you have to pay us. And so they're taking a bigger and bigger share of the profits from their marketplace. And so there's two things I'm trying to do, which is sort of to map out the mechanisms by which they do this, which are both algorithmic and design, but also to think about why they do it. What are the pressures in our economy that force these companies to turn extractive? And secondly, what are the signals that we might be able to identify that might lead to a different theory of antitrust, which is not just about consumer harm or benefit, but looks at these particularly these large aggregators as the central node of an ecosystem of suppliers and consumers. They really are running their own invisible hand. And are they being a fair player? And you can look at that through the allocation of value to the suppliers, to the consumers, and to themselves, and how that changes over time.
Shoshana, I'm going to allow you to say anything you want in your opening kind of comments, but just one request. Tim often looks also in his great articles that he's written in different places like Quartz at the kind of before and after moment. And Tim, I don't want to make it sound simplistic, but basically also what you've just said is there was kind of this more golden age when Google and Amazon in some ways really were using algorithms, again, to create value, allowing all sorts of different things to rise up on the web based on what people were kind of looking for versus just marketing their own products. And you said something at the UCL large lecture theory that I'll never forget. You said, you think you're searching Google for free. Well, guess what? Google is searching you for free. And that was before too. So just to allow you to give us your view also of why maybe it's not just before and after, but it's been a continuous issue or not. I'm just trying to.
Let's go for it. So the Google narrative and how we analyze it is fundamentally distinct from the Amazon narrative, and they meet at the end, but on the way through, they're two different stories. So what we're talking about here, when you talk about rents, rents are a function of power, and the power is really derived from the authority of property rights. So the question is, you can't have the rents if you can't extract the rents unless you have the data. How do they get property rights on the data? So this is where my analysis begins. So what we're facing, a way to sort of summarize and efficiently predict what's going on here, is to understand the economic logic of surveillance capitalism, which is a thing that is invented by people at a historical moment under very specific material and historical conditions. It is not something that is, in my view, driven in a general way by the economy. It's driven by the dynamics of surveillance capitalism itself. Let me explain. So in the beginning, let's talk about, the year 2000 as the beginning. We're really at the brink of the 21st century. In the year 2000, only 25% of all the world's information was stored digitally, right? So we're still we haven't taken that big step into what I think of as information civilization. This is a point where we have the fledgling internet companies. Google is right there in Silicon Valley. People thought of it as having the best search engine. Even then, the smartest founders, the swankiest investors, venture capitalists. But then comes the dot-com bust. And so here's an historical moment that produced unusual conditions of financial emergency. Because even here in this company that had so much going for it, investors were threatening to pull out. Google had the best search engine, but they hadn't yet figured out how to make money. They had a plan. The plan was to start selling their search engine to large internet companies and large corporations. They had a plan, but it was going to take some time, and it hadn't all been put into motion or come to fruition yet. In the heat of financial emergency is when they stumbled into, discovered, all of these kinds of things are a combination of trial and error, making your way through the fog of war, but also really applying the resources and intelligence you have to actually invent something. And so out of that whole mix, they discovered at Google at this particular time that they had a lot of data left over in the servers, what they called data exhaust, digital exhaust, waste material, and that they could now, through stuff that had been going on informally in the company, they figured out that they could mine these data exhaust for signals that predicted the behavior of users. That's how surveillance capitalism began to be formulated. Now the idea was we have to monetize fast, otherwise we're going to go down just like everybody else. The way we're going to monetize fast is advertising. This, despite the fact that the founders had written and spoken eloquently about advertising as something that would corrupt search and corrupt the internet. So now advertising was going to be the key to monetization. They discovered in a series of events that they could use these predictive signals to discover something called the click-through rate, a prediction of where a user was likely to click on an ad and click through an ad. And here we have the rudiments of surveillance capitalism. Fundamentally change the value proposition for advertisers. Instead of doing what they've always done, which is to figure out where they should put their ads, now they were going to be dependent upon two things: Google's already considerable cache of personal information that nobody knew about, nobody else had, and Google's already considerable analytic capabilities that they already back in 2000 referred to as our AI. AI is a moving target. All right, so fast forward. They put this into implementation. It works, but they keep it a secret. Nobody knows how well it works until 2004 when they IPO. At that point was the first time that we started to see numbers. And what it showed is that from 2001 to 2004, their revenue line, were they making money? Their revenue line increased by 3,590%. That is what I call the surveillance dividend. And the surveillance dividend is what has driven this. The surveillance dividend mesmerized investors, and therefore it mesmerized entrepreneurs. So this model jumped from Google to Facebook. From there, it became the default option in the tech sector. And from there, it has traveled through what we used to think of as the normal economy to become a driver in virtually every industry, and clearly some more than others: education, health, insurance, finance, real estate. We see it all over the place. All right, so what we have is an extraordinary situation here, and I'll wrap up these comments by saying, why call it surveillance capitalism? The reason is not to be melodramatic or overstate the case. The reason is technical. The reason is that because this economic logic combines traditional elements of capitalism, the emphasis on profit, the emphasis on private property, on economic growth, on market exchange, all of these things that have been elements of capitalism for centuries are prominent here. The difference is that these elements cannot be realized. They cannot become successful without the technologies and social relations of surveillance. Surveillance capitalism is born digital. It is only imaginable within the digital milieu. So what does it do? It unilaterally claims its right to, first of all, invade personal experience, and second of all, to lift, to capture, to extract from personal experience, personal information, behavioral data. And then, and here is the truly extraordinary moment, and then it instantly claims those illicitly, through surveillance, through hidden means of observation and extraction, it illicitly claims those data as private property. It claims property rights over these caches of personal information that it has illegitimately taken, which is to say it has stolen. So the theory of surveillance capitalism, the key point here is that the theory of surveillance capitalism challenges these property rights. So what surveillance capitalism does is to say these rents are illegitimate because the power and authority on which those rents are claimed are fundamentally illegitimate. And therefore, surveillance capitalism challenges the legitimacy of extraction itself. The problem, of course, is that we don't have laws to make extraction illegal. We don't have laws to make extraction illegal yet. And that's where we are now. And that's where, you know, this next decade of creativity and invention, that's where we're heading. How we challenge this property claim, unwind it in order to free the space for a capitalism that actually leverages the digital for the sake of individuals, society, and in a way that advances democracy.
Tim, I just want to bring you back in on that exact point, because anytime we look at rents and we use the word rent, we're obviously comparing it to something else, some sort of notion of normal profits, or some sort of notion of maybe what the right way of doing something is, and then the departure from that way. Instead, I think what's interesting of what Shoshana is talking about is actually this was kind of a natural evolution of the way that the sector itself was actually almost set up to work, that it actually, its normal way of working is producing these rents. So in that sense, we almost can't use the word rents, which by definition have to compare to something else. And when, you know, you and I have talked a lot about how interesting it was how Google had this slogan of don't be evil, then all of a sudden that slogan left, maybe because they decided to be evil, who knows. But, you know, this issue of the advertising, which both of you, in fact, have talked about, what you mentioned, Tim, in your opening comments was that this pressure actually then to rely not only on advertising, but on a particular model that was no longer really benefiting consumers, but especially the whole supply chain, came also from some perhaps external pressures, let's call it the financial industry or the financialization of big tech. So just over to you in terms of kind of unwinding some of that.
It's interesting because I think obviously both Shoshana and I have, you know, some overlapping ideas. Shoshana, you clearly see this as the sort of the original sin of the internet, you know, like from the beginning baked in this failure. And I certainly agree with you.
Not of the internet, not of the internet.
Of the advertising model, of the, you know.
Of a specific economic logic that hijacked the internet, that hijacked the digital.
Sure. No, yes, I misspoke. I don't mean the internet.
Well, I only jump on that, Tim, because it's so important to distinguish the technology from the way we're using it. And
I personally believe that the technology, which that you call surveillance capitalism, you know, when I first started talking about it, I called it collective intelligence. It's like, hey, we are learning from everybody, and I really see in the first stage, you know, from 2000 to maybe 2010 or 11, I primarily see Google and Amazon using, and again, maybe different with other players, primarily using that for the benefit of their users. And so they were acting as trustees of that data in many ways, you know, saying, oh, we can give you something as a result of this information that's really useful to you. And, you know, but what really is interesting to me is that at some point they stopped making the value that they produced for others using this information be their primary goal. And I think it has to do with you know, kind of like the master commandment of our modern capitalism, which is far deeper, I think, than just surveillance capitalism, which is profit maximization. The idea that somehow it is normal to say more, regardless of how big you get. And these companies, there's sort of another concept that's related to rent that I got from Josh Ryan Collins' book on land rents, which is there's a kind of rent which is really a collective good. You know, it's not just like the extractive rents. There is the rent that happens when we collectively build something together. You know, the value of your house goes up because they put in a new school, or there's a new restaurant in the neighborhood, or other people have moved in and improved their homes. And that land rent appreciation is a good rent. And then there's this extractive rent. And what I sort of see was there was this first phase from, you know, the early days of the internet after the dot-com bust, where we really were creating this collective value together. And then that starts, the growth of the internet starts to slow down. You have new threats to these companies, and they go, well, we have to somehow maintain our rate of growth. And that's when they turn to the extractive robber baron type of rents. And that's, I guess, a somewhat difference. I think that this technology, even in advertising, Google's early advertising, it was very strictly segregated from the information harvesting they used for organic search results. They had it off to the side. You could ignore it. And they were using that power with some restraint, and then they stopped doing that. And so to me, there's kind of I have a hard time with the idea that the collection of collective data for our collective benefit, of which there are so many good examples, is an absolute evil from day one. I think it's how we use it, and do we use it for the benefit of the people from whom it's collected, or do we use it against them?
So just coming, again, stepping back, one of the concepts that the Institute tries to elaborate and actually develop a stronger theory on is actually markets, right? So markets and businesses are not the same thing. Whenever we say the state versus the market, that's like the wrong dichotomy. There's the state, different types of state institutions, business, different types of business institutions. How they are governed and how they interact produces the kind of market outcomes we get. So I think, Shoshana, you were kind of getting to that before, which is the economy itself is not a deterministic thing. It's an outcome of actual decisions we have made collectively in particular governance structures. And we can also undo them, right? If we want a better system, or rethink them, or redesign them, or sometimes new tools. The fact that the mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, actually brought in hackers, computer hackers, into her civil service, into the city team, in order to actually make sure that data, when it's created by citizens, every time they click on Citymap or Uber, whatever, actually benefits the city to make better decisions, more innovative decisions around social housing and public transport, required a new institution. It's actually a data commons and city civil hackers. So, you talked about IPR, intellectual property rights, Shoshana, but we know from the health sector, for example, that it's not the property rights themselves, it's not the intellectual property rights, it's how they've been completely abused. In health, intellectual property rights are way too upstream, so we're allowing the tools for research to be patented, as opposed to what patents were meant for. They're way too wide, used for strategic reasons to keep out anyone. That doesn't allow us that kind of collective intelligence, Tim, that you're talking about. And they're way too strong, so really hard to license. So even just those three things there could get unpicked, because decisions were made within regulatory authorities to allow that, and governance structures of maximizing profits in the big pharmaceutical companies, just like with big tech, have also then use that in order to maximize shares and so on. So what would we unpick with intellectual property rights? We couldn't say they don't exist. What exactly around the property rights angle of things would you say, if you were speaking to a competition authority or an innovation policy person, what exactly would we change so that we don't just use the word property rights, but come up with the recipe or the beginning of a recipe?
So for everyone who's listening right now, I'm gonna come back to this theme and no doubt stress it over and over again. We have to separate these two domains. One is the digital, the data, the technology, right? That's over here. The other is the institutional logic. Surveillance capitalism is a political economic institution. It would not have gotten off the ground had it not been for an absence of law to regulate, even just to regulate basic privacy of personal information. In the United States, in the year 2000, there were active discussions on Capitol Hill about federal privacy legislation, even in 2001. Even on September 10th, 2001. Once the war on terror broke out, all those conversations shifted from privacy to total information awareness. That's one of the key historical conditions that allowed this Google discovery and its nascent surveillance capabilities to thrive rather than to meet law. So we're talking about a political economic institution on the one hand, and we're talking about data and digital technologies on the other. So from the point of view of surveillance capitalism, what's happened is there was a window before the surveillance dividend was understood. There was a window when things were working more or less the way we all expected. The idea that, like there are people back in the year 2000, 2001 who were designing telehealth, who were designing smart homes. And the way they went about those designs was to say, hey, these are basically closed loop operations in the sense that we're going to produce data. We're going to use the technologies to produce data. The data goes to the person who lives in the house. And the person who lives in the house, it is their inalienable right to have exclusive access to those data, to decide figure out what they mean, how they want to use it, with whom they want to share it, and to what end. Well, all of that is what changed. With surveillance capitalism, what we see is a very different process. These things split. So this first process where we use data to improve products and services, for the individual, for the consumer, for the user. These are all different nomenclatures that have meaning, but just for the moment, I'll put them together. That process where there's that, really healthy feedback loop, that's what I call the behavioral value reinvestment cycle. The idea that, yeah, we're gathering data, but first of all, the data gathering is transparent. You're giving us stuff, that we're taking it, we're using it to improve the product or service for you. So it's transparent, there's accountability, and the value accrues to that user or consumer. Well, once this other process of illegitimately invading a personal experience, translating it into behavioral data, collecting those data for predictions that are then sold to business customers who have an interest in predicting the future of human behavior. These prediction markets have nothing to do with the user or consumer well-being. So these are data now that are being extracted that are more than what is needed for product or service improvement. They're surplus. These are the zero cost assets. And this surplus is what moves into the supply chains, what goes to the AI, what gets computed as predictions, and then initially sold to advertisers to create what became those historically lucrative markets. But now there are many markets in different industries that trade in human futures, like we have pork belly futures or oil or wheat or copper futures. So this is what I call behavioral surplus. And these data flows are in contrast to the ones that go back and improve products and services. What happened at Amazon was Amazon had created the most powerful behavioral value reinvestment cycle of any company probably in history, collecting all of these data, and as Tim said, really using it for the sake of its customers. But eventually, and someday we'll know the inside story of this, we don't know it right now, but eventually, sometime over the last 8 years or so, Amazon figured out the surveillance dividend, and it figured out the margins that it was leaving on the table. It figured out the revenues it was leaving on the table. And it decided to stop leaving those on the table. And that's when it went, headlong into building the surveillance capitalism and going for the extraction and the surveillance dividend on top of the business that it already had. And that's what we're suffering from now with Amazon. So the reason that this is so important, and I'll wrap up right here, Mariana, is to say that the reason that these companies can drive for more is that in the history of capitalism, there is only one thing that curbs the drive for more, as Tim says. That one thing is law. And the only reason they've been able to drive this extraction so that behavioral surplus now dwarfs the data that is used for product and service improvement is only a tiny fraction of these huge flows of behavioral surplus that have created the now officially, as of yesterday, all 5 of these trillion-dollar market cap companies that are the big surveillance empires. So the only thing that stops this now is law, which is why in my opening remarks, I said, you know, this is where the game is now. The game is in politics. The game is in charters of rights and laws and the institutions to oversee them that will make it impossible for them to keep driving toward more and more and more on what is fundamentally an illegitimate, destructive to society, destructive to individuals, and destructive to democracy economic logic.
Yeah.
Thanks, Shoshana. And by the way, if anyone wants to look at the law question in a deep way, read Katerina Pistor's book, The Code of Capital. It's fantastic. And we had her recently in one of our sessions. Tim, feel free to come in. And then I wanted to ask you a question about profits.
Yeah, I want to sort of jump in on this idea that the only thing that stops this is law. I actually see this much more in ecological terms. You know, if you think about what happens in a predator-prey situation, you know, you get things get out of balance, and there's a crash. Things get out of balance. Some other invasive species comes in, and I think we have a similar thing in economics. And I see it right now with Amazon and Shopify. You know, one of the Shopify execs said to me, you know, Amazon got it wrong enough for us to exist. And this is really root in my observations of the tech industry. You know, it goes back to when Microsoft was the kingpin of the tech industry. And I remember this conversation that, Walt Mossberg, who used to write for the Wall Street Journal and then, ran All Things Digital with Kara Swisher. He talked about a conversation he had with Steve Ballmer. And he said, Steve, if you guys would just be like 5% less greedy, it would make all the difference. And, there is not, I look at the collective good of gathering this data. A really easy one is traffic and routing in Google Maps. It's data, we're all being observed, and it's fed back to us as a collective good. It's not an individual thing, it is a collective thing. I also think it's true of advertising. Google's original advertising was actually designed to be useful. And I think in the same way, if you think of the internet before Google, advertising was incredibly intrusive, incredibly obnoxious, untargeted, and they actually made it better. And then they stopped making it better. And that to me is the thing we need to understand. It's not fundamental to the system that surveillance should be used against us. And there's certainly things that we could and should have done in terms of particularly personally identifiable information. But I also worry, and we see a lot of this from healthcare, where we've gone too far in that direction. Laws to protect personal healthcare information has made it harder to do research, for example. So there's a check, and there's 2 checks, and one is the moral check. Adam Smith talked about this not in The Wealth of Nations, but in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. There is a moral check on self-interest. And we need to encourage that moral check on self-interest. And secondly, there is this ecological check. When companies take too much, they basically create an opportunity for others. When Microsoft took too much from the PC ecosystem, all the developers said, we can't make money anymore. Anything we do that's good, Microsoft comes and takes it. So they went and they said, well, we're going to do open source software. We're going to go play with this new internet thing. And they built entirely new opportunities. And I see it happening again today, where there's new companies that are figuring out how to do search in a different way. There's some really interesting things where AI models are going to actually encapsulate a lot of the knowledge that was extracted by Google and held as their private property, and they've actually made it available through release, for example, of BERT. in ways that are going to enable new kinds of competitors. In the case of Amazon, they start extracting too much from their merchants, and merchants go, hey, it's not worth as much to us to be part of Amazon's ecosystem anymore. We're going to have to invest in our own website again. And suddenly you see Stripe, you see Shopify creating this new alternative to Amazon that's not extracting the rents. And so I do think that they're creating their own competition by being too greedy. And both the moral check and the pragmatic check are there in addition to anything we want to do legally. And I think we need to encourage the companies to go, oh, it's in our self-interest to go back to working this stuff for the benefit of our users and to stop taking too much for ourselves.
Can I just offer a bit of reflection on the words I'm hearing? Because they're all like too much, in excess, surplus. And it always comes back to compared to what, right? So in some ways, Tim, I think against a lot of what you usually say to me in our conversations, you almost sound like, and I know you don't mean this, but let me just be a bit provocative. That's what I'm supposed to do as moderator, that you're talking about equilibrating forces, right? Let them be greedy. They'll at some point realize that it's wrong, or not let them, but nudge them into a different way. Their own greed is going to allow all these new startups to come out and fill the gap that they're creating, the moral gap and the trust gap and all sorts of other gaps. And I know you don't actually think like that. So you just sounded different from what you usually say. Because I think what you mean, sorry, I shouldn't, I'm not going to say what you mean. You were actually quite eloquent in what you said. But I think what's so interesting on how you put it, when you think of it as a predator-prey and ecological way, is not the kind of Newtonian physics way of thinking of equilibration, that it almost happens on its own, some sort of center of gravity that things go towards, and any problem is just a transient problem towards some sort of long-run equilibria. But by talking about predator prey and ecology, you're actually talking also about biological systems, which we know can also get really out of whack. Look at climate change, right?
That's right.
So on the one hand, of course, one could say that the solution to the problem that you just talked about, again, really well, is kind of strong regulation also to come in and prevent certain types of behaviors. But I kind of come back to, this whole digital feudalism title of this session is also about trying to understand how that behavioral surplus that Shoshana is talking about is in some ways embedded right now in what we have almost accepted to be the rules of the game. So even just looking at profit rates, I know that in some of our discussions, I think you told me once that, Jeff Bezos's net worth is something like, I don't know, 196 billion right now. But if he was actually making money based on what Amazon actually kind of produces and does, it would be like 6 billion. And that's the financialization bit, which is a separate issue. But then because they're financialized, they're also being pressed in some ways to create all this behavioral surplus that Shoshana talks about, or no, just sorry, over to you.
Yeah, I just want to respond really quickly to the market cap thing. I think that's one of the biggest category errors that we have in talking about these companies. We talk about market cap as though it reflects something about their profits, and it doesn't.
Yeah.
The fact is there are many companies that have a higher rate of profit, certainly than Amazon. Amazon's only starting, to get, it was very powerful and very large with a very small level of profit. And the example I'm giving is if Jeff Bezos if it were a private company and he had his share of its profits, he'd be worth, 6 or 7 billion, not 150 or 160 billion. And that's the betting economy, people betting on these stocks. Elon Musk also, worth close to, $150 billion. And, he basically has had no profit. So there's no, every time somebody talks about market cap, they're no longer talking about the operating economy and the rate of profit. It's a totally disjunct economy in which we have too much cash flowing around and people are throwing it at things. And I think we need to tackle those two problems separately.
Right. But so if there's all this cash being thrown, right, at Bezos because of the gambling casino of our system, then why have to go after these kind of bad things? Because in some ways, when I hear you speak, the idea is that if they would only operate with kind of at the fair game level and not do those extra things that they're doing that Shoshana writes about, which actually they almost don't need to do, but they're doing.
Right. They don't need to do.
Exactly. So can we just stop there for a minute? Because that they don't need to do is what I'm trying to do. Like, I wish I had a blackboard, right? So you have some sort of baseline of what you think the right production structure would be, right? Instead, they're doing something else in order to what? Earn more money, but they already have all this money being thrown at them, you're saying, right? So there's this kind of
Well, they
weird.
have it thrown at them because they are allocating more of the value to themselves.
Exactly. So that
I
was
mean,
what I was trying to say before, which
yeah.
is that this financialized model of all this money going after them because of this gambling casino is not unconnected to the fact that then they choose to go above and beyond what they could be doing to earn some sort of, in quotes, normal rate of profit. I don't want to use the word normal rate of profit because that would bring us to a whole other discussion. But do you see what I'm saying? What is the connection between the financialized?
You know, the range of, Tesla, for example, there is no normal rate of profit. I mean, it's not, they're just too loosely connected for market cap to be a useful measure in this regard. But to your question
So can I weigh in?
Yeah, Shoshana, come in. Sorry.
Thanks. So, the idea that we can rely on moral suasion to
not
get these
only on
companies.
moral suasion, not only on moral suasion.
I didn't finish my sentence yet. I didn't finish my sentence yet. The idea that we can rely on moral suasion to get companies to like do good capitalism. This has always been a bad idea in the sense that it doesn't graph onto empirical facts at any point in history. But despite it being a bad idea, it has been the operative idea now for 20 years. For 20 years, the companies have been unregulated. For 20 years, everyone has been saying, that companies can self-regulate, that they can figure out the right balance, and they will, and this is where the natural fallacy comes in. They're successful, therefore they must be good, and so forth. So for 20 years, they have had a free run to do literally whatever they want to do, to dress it up in whatever kind of gaslighting rhetoric they choose to dress it up in, to drive this propaganda of inevitability, that the way they operate is somehow the inevitable consequence of digital technologies and so forth. This is what has landed us in the situation we're in today. There has never been a time when targeted advertising was something that was good for users, although there was a time when Sergey Brin and Larry Page, Google's founders, worked very hard to gin up a story about why targeted advertising was good for users. But my reading of every published utterance suggests that even at that time, they were trying to talk themselves into something because they had essentially declared a state of exception on their own stated values and principles in order to move forward in this direction. So, so when we talk about the collective good, I am 100% with Tim on this, the collective good. The problem is that we began down this road believing that all of these data were going to be used for the collective good. That's why there hasn't been mass protest. That's why there hasn't been a social movement, because all surveillance capitalism is happening in a way that's hidden. It's happening behind the scenes. It's designed to be decipherable. It's designed to engineer the ignorance of the public and even of lawmakers. So we believed that somehow, data would be used for the collective good. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Once surveillance capitalism became entrenched, it has essentially mediated now the relationship between essentially in every sector of consumption and the data, so that the data, the internet, the web, however you want to think about it, these are all essentially now owned and operated by this political economic institution. And the aim now for us as citizens, whether we think of ourselves as users or consumers, is separate from the fact that we're citizens. Many of us are citizens of democratic societies. And the issue for us is, what do we do now through law, through regulation, through the elaboration of new charters of rights? What do we do to be able to clear the space so that we interrupt and outlaw the operations of this institution, and we clear the space for two things? One, we clear the space for new competitors. I don't qualify Shopify as a new competitor, by the way. Happy to have that discussion. But we clear the space for genuine new competitors, because they're no longer competing for capital against the surveillance dividend. And the second thing we do is we clear the space for actually finally being able to have data and the digital milieu, digital technologies that operate so that data collection is tied to fundamental rights, which it is not now, and data use is tied to public service. It's tied to the collective good, whether or not that is the climate crisis or curing disease, or actually realigning supply and demand so that we're finally using data to address individual needs, which is where we got started on this road 20 years ago. So we've got to get through surveillance capitalism in order to get back to that kind of capability.
I'm going to bring in some questions in just a minute, but before I do so, we have 4 minutes until we go to the Q&A. How much do you both think that we actually also need to redefine some of the words? Again, value creation in this sector, but even data. You said, Shoshana, you have data and technology here, and then you have the institutions, the laws there, but actually the data itself and how we use the word data, how we use the word technology is in some ways very siloed. I mean, I always say, don't call them big tech. Most of that tech actually came from public investments. And that actually means we should be regulating them also as media companies, which if you actually think of what a lot of these companies are actually doing, it is more almost in the media sector than in the tech sector. Anyway, that's a huge debate, but just, instead of just using these words and saying data and tech is here, institutions and law are there, can we just talk a bit about value? Because IIPP always talks about value, public value, collective value, the common good, and data in terms of what you think would be useful also to the policymakers, but also for discussions like these to not get confused, right? You hear people saying data is the new oil. Well, actually, it's not, is it? In terms of what it actually is. So Shoshana,
Well,
just a bit of what is data?
That they both should be left in the ground. In other words, that extraction in both cases is the problem. So was there a question there, or I wasn't?
Yeah, just how much of the problem is even, in fact, I'm sorry, I'll even read one of the questions here, because Sushant Kumar, who heads the part of the Omidyar Network that's dedicated to digital platforms, asks, we're living in the world of surveillance capitalism due to the absence of law and also the use of law to apply property rights to data. Will law lead us out of this, changes to institutions and laws, or do we also have to rethink the underlying economics with a new definition of data and how value can actually be created in order to get these kind of common good, results that we're all interested in?
I think the point about, law is the problem and law is the solution. The way I think of it is, surveillance capitalism has put democracy under siege, yes, but the complexity here is that only democracy has the countervailing power to end the siege. So it's one of these kinds of conundrums. So don't lose heart. This is an especially important theme to talk about in light of yesterday's antitrust decision in the American courts here, where a judge threw out the two big lawsuits against Facebook for antitrust, one brought by a large group of attorney generals and the other brought by the Federal Trade Commission. And, and so on the face of it, that looks like, oh gosh, law is not working for us. That's not what that decision yesterday means. What's happening now really tracks very much in the historical pattern. Judicial opinion is almost always backward looking. Judicial opinion looks at case law, it looks at the history, and it also takes as its floor, it takes existing legislation as its floor. So judicial opinion, for example, in the early 20th century in the United States, since we're talking about this case yesterday, in the early 20th century, judicial opinion almost always sided with owners, employers, property rights against the rights of workers to organize and to assert the right to organize, to bargain collectively, to join unions and so forth, and against the rights of consumers. And it took that kind of back and forth over quite a few decades until citizens came together with lawmakers to drive the legislation that put a new floor under what the courts could do. And so this is the process that we're in now, everybody. It's the fact that the court decided this way is not a failure of law. It's more like, and so it begins. Here we have like the jetpack now attached to our lawmakers saying, okay, if we needed any proof that we've really got to enact new regulatory frameworks and new law and new charters of rights, here's the proof, because that is the only way we're going to push the courts forward. This is what's called the life of the law. So I think that when you look at public opinion in the US, which has lagged on privacy and the whole techlash phenomenon, lagged compared to Europe. Right now, public opinion in the US shows a wholesale rupture of faith with this sector, with these companies. And I think when you put that together with where our lawmakers are coming out, we're going to see decisive movement in this arena. And you need to join that. Everybody listening today, they said 900 people registered. Everybody listening today, this is the work that we have in front of us to keep the wheel of democracy turning and strong and healthy. This is what falls to us in our time, the work that we do. It's not a failure. It's how all of this operates. And now it falls to us to drive this new trajectory in the march toward a digital future that can also be democratic.
Thanks, Shoshana. I'm sure that's also very inspiring to students listening, because students in some ways have been on the front line of the climate change battle. If you think of Fridays for the Future, and the data battle is very much one of young people, just given all the different apps and technologies they're using in Generation Z. So the judge you were talking about, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Is it Boasberg or Boasberg?
Yeah.
He's given 30 days, right, to actually come up with it. Sorry? 30 days
FTC.
To the FTC, exactly, to get a stronger case, as about Facebook's monopoly power. So Tim, this is something that, again, the work we're actually doing in our project is very much trying to unpack exactly what form of monopoly this is, unlike the kind of classic one that you might look at in terms of producer and consumer surplus and so on. And so given that we also actually have a very progressive person running the FTC now with Lina Khan, if you had kind of three things, this is what someone's asked in the questions, what 2 or 3 things should Khan focus on? What should be setting the FTC's regulatory agenda? And how can the FTC pull back surveillance capitalism, but also connected to the other question, actually, provide an underlying framework that can help, happen in the next 30 days, what we want to see happen in terms of this going back to the court?
Well, the thing I've been focused on, I struggle to apply it to Facebook, but I certainly see it for very clearly for Google and Amazon, and that is that the harm is evident to the supply side of a marketplace before it is evident to on the consumer side. And therefore, I would say, look at the entire system and the allocations of value within the entire system and how they are changing, rather than simply, it's like, because there really are three players. There's the marketplace or aggregator who controls the marketplace. There's the suppliers and there's the consumers. And how has the allocation of value changed over time seems to be a tool that they don't use enough to get a systemic view. So that'd be the first thing. I think the second thing that I would, think about, and this is really from the point of view of any regulator, which is how do you start to regulate by outcomes rather than by trying to specify a set of behaviors? Because that's whack-a-mole. And we see the failure of so many regulations because they basically identify some particular set of problems, loopholes, and they outlaw them or restrict them or regulate them, and then people find a new one. And the thing that's so interesting to me about the Silicon Valley technology is instead it says, we're going to focus on the outcome and we're going to change the rules all the time. Now, I wrote about this, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago in a piece that I called Algorithmic Regulation. How do we build regulations that actually say, well, this is the thing we're going to measure, and we're going to keep tweaking the rules when we see that measure go out of whack? Because I do think that our regulators don't really think that way. And so if you kind of say, well, we're going to actually be measuring this particular harm, and if the rules that we put in place didn't work, we're going to come up with some new ones right away. We're not going to say, well, we again, and we need different processes. And I think part of that actually is to give in an odd way, and in a risky way, more power to regulatory agencies and less to, for legislative bodies to be less specific. And I think we've gone a long way in our government wrong. I think of the National Highway Act, which which set up the U.S. interstate highway, and it was 29 pages. It basically said, we're going to do this thing. It said an outcome. We're going to build these roads, and then go figure out how to do it. And now we have bills that are, in the U.S. that are, 3,000 or 4,000 pages long, where a bunch of people who don't know the details of how we're going to actually do the thing are specifying it in exhaustive detail, which of course lets all the lobbyists in because they're the only ones who know enough to write the damn language. And it's broken. So I would just say, focus on outcomes.
That's what, as you know, in IIPP, we call the kind of mission-oriented approach, right? You focus on, reducing the digital divide, getting the plastic out of the ocean, having a carbon neutral city, and get as many different actors involved and keep open the how, but focus on the target and make sure you design all the tools, procurement, grants, and loans in such a way that really fosters that collective intelligence, but to get there, to get to the result. However, if along the way you're allowing all sorts of very problematic processes like the ones that Shoshana talks about, you could actually have a scenario where kind of mission accomplished, but through the wrong means. And if those wrong means are precisely the ones that Shoshana looks at in terms of, the behavioral surplus and, all sorts of issues around privacy, trust, self-confidence. I mean, I've got 4 teenagers, and I think, Shoshana, I got you also talking to some of the work that they were doing in terms of actually talking to their friends. I mean, their friends have no idea just what information about themselves is being given, but not only that, they're quite actually conscious about how their own senses of self-worth as teenagers is being affected by, let's just call it what it is, kind of social media and that whole phenomena. So if along the way you are kind of really hurting people's self-confidence or sense of self-worth, their ability to have empathy, to be humans, that's a problem. So the behaviors do matter for sure. Maybe not in the way that economists have modeled behavior with kind of rational economic man, but I think what Shoshana is looking at is that behaviors do matter along the way, even if the final goal might be some sort of, benevolent result. So I guess it's definitely both. So other questions here, we've got a lot of them. Let me just, well, actually, I did want to ask Shoshana if you had 2 things that you could tell Lina Khan to focus on in her first 100 days in office, what would you say in a way that could actually give her a plan with her team?
Yeah. Well, first of all, antitrust has an important role to play. And I think its most important role, as far as monopoly goes, is to be able to leverage regulation and legislation to open up the playing field, to open up the competitive landscape, so we can actually get different kinds of companies who want to come into this space and want to play the game differently along the lines that we've been discussing. So that's where the structural issues of antitrust come in. And it's worth mentioning that in Europe now, the EU is considering two very important large new legislative frameworks. One is the Digital Services Act, one is the Digital Markets Act. And what we see here in the Digital Markets Act, has spelled out this principle of ex ante regulation. So here in this legislation, regulators are doing just precisely what Tim has talked about. They're offering a principle-based approach to regulation, and they're saying that as we track these principles and their metrics, and we see that something is just at the beginning, but the pattern that it's going to be producing, we can intervene, and we can bring the full weight of this regulatory oversight and enforcement as we see it beginning, rather than always having to play catch up with these companies where they're now 20 steps ahead of us, and we're just figuring out how to catch up with what they did in stage one. So we're moving toward that. We see it in Europe, and I'm certainly hopeful that we'll see it in America as well. Right now the FTC is pledged to antitrust. Lina Khan has been a brilliant pioneer in the U.S. antitrust law, not only in applying it, but in understanding how antitrust law needs to be reinterpreted and redefined beyond the narrow range of economic harms that have traditionally defined it. This is so important because what hasn't yet been said in our conversation is that surveillance capitalism, when we talk about its consequences, Mariana, its harms, they are not constrained to the economic domain. When we talk about whether we begin with epistemic rights, the rights to know, which the rights to know are the cause of which privacy is the effect. So we talk about this wholesale destruction of privacy that we've already seen in the last 2 decades. Well, that's not an economic harm. That's a harm that is affecting your children, their friends. It's affecting and changing all of us. But then we move on from that because the companies have usurped all of the rights to know. It means that there's this whole new axis of inequality in our societies, these huge concentrations of knowledge about us. And that has created a profound disjuncture in our society. What are they using those concentrations of knowledge for? They're using it to analyze and predict our behavior and manipulate and modify our attitudes and our actions. So this creates a new kind of power. Yeah. And on it goes. And ultimately, it produces those power imbalances, produce disinformation and misinformation, amplified, taking aim at society, taking aim at democracy, and so forth. So these are all social harms and societal harms and political harms. So Lina Khan has been a leader in understanding that antitrust has to be enriched and expanded so that we can now understand the unique harms of our time and our place. Beyond antitrust, however, there are two key things that I would hope that Chair Khan would be addressing. Ultimately, we have to address extraction itself. Extraction, as I've argued, is already fundamentally illegitimate. This whole economic edifice is built on an illegitimate bed of sand. We have to address extraction. Extraction is the root cause of all the harms that we've been discussing. And as in the case of climate, unless we address extraction head on, we can't solve climate. And it's the same in this case. And the second thing that's going to rise now to the horizon, I hope for the FTC to address, first is extraction, and the second is going after the financial incentives for extraction. The idea that we can have markets that trade in human futures. These are the markets that provide the incentives for that ultimately produce all of these dangerous consequences. We should outlaw human futures markets in the same way that we outlaw markets that trade in human organs or that trade in people. We know how to do that. We've done it before. We can do it again. And I think the case can be very strongly made that all markets where profits depend upon making human behavior more predictable across every social domain will inevitably have anti-human, anti-freedom, and anti-democratic consequences. So last point, Chair Khan is a close colleague of former Commissioner, FTC Commissioner Rohit Chopra, who is in line to be to have another key consumer role in the Biden administration. And Commissioner Chopra, back in January, had already commissioned a group to look into exactly what I've just described to you, to look beyond antitrust and to take the commission to looking into these further and deeper harms. And I certainly hope that Chair Khan will follow and expand and really build on that lead.
Thanks, Shoshana. And Tim, feel free to come in just in a minute, but I want to read off two questions which are connected. Yeah, exactly. Which there's two connected ones that actually address in some ways where you left off, Shoshana, because with climate, no one country is going to lead on its own. So one of the questions is also in terms of these rights, the right to know and the right to not be extracted as a person might need kind of international law. So two questions here. Can we establish coherent democratic international standards and regulations on the digital economy through existing international organizations? And what would that look like? And relatedly, if the data collected by tech companies can be a collective good, we need a new regulatory framework to democratize it. Should countries address this independently, or is there a stronger case more than ever for a supranational organization to pave the way? And what do you think in that context about data trusts and some of the rise of city-isms and so on? Smart cities, sorry, smart city-isms. Anyway, anything on the global dimension, whether this can actually be done by any one country alone, beyond just saying one country might lead and others follow, what does the international collaboration and regulation look like?
You know, I think one of the things that suggests to me, and this is really not an answer to the question, but there is a fundamental power in decentralization. And, you know, what Justice Brandeis called, and then Tim Wu channeled, the curse of bigness is part of the problem. You know, we have an economy that optimizes for bigness in the name of efficiency. And, you know, I think part of what will break the power is a different architecture. You know, we saw that with the internet, which pushed things out to the leaf nodes. And I think it applies somewhat to regulation as well. You know, in certain ways, a coordinated set of regulations may be more fragile than a set of uncoordinated regulations. You know, again, it's hard to know the balance, but I think about it also in terms of market. Somebody asked in the questions, you know, what would you know, a better search look like? And I would go, decentralized search. And that's one of the things I'm super interested in, because we built like a better search for our O'Reilly platform based on a technology that Google released as open source, which is their BERT language model. And it's so interesting because it reminds me a lot of IBM releasing the code, the architecture of the PC, which broke their early, monopoly over the computer industry. And I think Google has sown the seeds of there being the possibility of independent parties being able to do much better search than they could in the past. And I think, that's why Shoshana, we should talk more about Shopify. I look at Shopify and Stripe as decentralizing factors relative to the big centralized powers. And I think this thing that Google's done with BERT will add to that. So we actually will see potentially the rise of more decentralized competition, rather than that we just wish for another big centralized player with a better business model, or we come up with a regulation that somehow allows us to still have these big centralized players. We really need to be thinking about what is the new decentralized architecture.
You could argue that a centralized one actually then would create a certain playing field. I don't want to say level playing field, I don't believe in that word, but a playing field within which this experimentation can happen. And without that, you just have a race to the bottom, as we've seen with taxation. And only when you have a collective approach to taxation are there then rules within which civilization can
The devil's
happen.
in the details, because there's certainly things that we want to have a collective approach to across nations. You look at climate, you look at taxation, absolutely. But I also think, you do look at even, you look at GDPR and how no problem for Facebook, it just raised the costs for much smaller players. And I don't think that
there's actually a question here on that of how sometimes regulations allow then kind of rule breaking to happen because it motivates you to get around the rules. So it says, Shoshana and Tim, you both note 2010 as a pivotal year in the direction of economic forces. Do either of you perhaps attribute this also to Dodd-Frank, which then caused financial agents to respond financial agents and corporations acted together to work within the new regulations to kind of game them? And if not, what particularly happened in 2010, which made both of you think of it as like the year of big change?
Well, the thing is that everything that we've been discussing, is happening in time. These are evolutionary processes, which is why I talk about this revolutionary takeover of knowledge, of what is known, of how it is known, of who can know it. I talk about surveillance capitalism as an epistemic coup that has proceeded in 4 stages, and those stages really, have grown and constituted themselves over the period of the last 20 years. They weren't there right from the start. So 2010 is a kind of rough turning point for a couple of reasons. One is a critical mass of data. I mentioned earlier that in the year 2000, only 25% of information was digitally stored. It wasn't until 2007. So that was 3 years after the Google IPO. So 7 years after surveillance capitalism was up and running. 2007, at that point, 97% of the world's information was digitally stored. So this is part of that evolutionary movement. And then, we're getting to a point where where there's enough knowledge that you go past that tipping point where knowledge becomes power. And the targeting, the ability to predict, the increasing lucrativeness of these prediction markets, all of that is growing and accreting in time. And so there's a kind of rough phase change between the first decade of the 21st century and then moving into the second decade, which is why I'm kind of riffing on that to say to everybody, the third decade The solutions that we're talking about, we need the national solutions, but we also need the solutions that are, that bring the liberal democracies together. The other thing that happened in 2010 was that was a period of time when China and the Chinese Communist Party began to look intentionally at how to design and deploy digital technology in ways that advanced its form of authoritarian government. The liberal democracies failed to do the same as a group, as a cohort. And that left a void, and surveillance capitalism, private capital, filled that void. That's what we're unraveling now. So yes, we have to move on the societal level, but then of course we've got to move certainly transatlantically, transnationally. This is the nature of information civilization. It's bigger than any one country. But again, we have to think of this in a decade-long process, where we take steps, we build on those steps, and then we take more steps, we build on those steps.
There's a question here that asks for kind of concrete examples of different types of contracts. Mickey McManus says, I see legal contracts all the time from tech companies that assert proprietary rights over the data and learning they collect. Are there template examples? Oh dear, now it's just that fit the Institute's vision that tech companies could consider instead. Are there any examples that, just like people have often looked in the patenting domain, showing how so much of the great kind of technology and innovation that occurred 50 years ago actually happened with very weak patent power. And that's often used to talk about the kind of changes we need in the health sector. What are the examples in the big tech space of maybe experiments around the world that you think would be interesting to start scaling up or to learn from? It could be city level examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where, Shoshana, is really onto something. We do need to actually assert that, no, you don't own this stuff, and there's certain kinds of ways that, we could, assert we collectively, through regulation, assert that you have only a custodial right to this. And, but I think it's very hard to manage, that kind of overreach, in the legal systems we have today, which basically, people basically claim power, and the only way to claim it back is, via an adversary system, which is very expensive for those who are on the outside. And therefore, if you have something which is very valuable, you have enormous incentives to, game the regulatory system, put up legal challenges. And it's very hard. There's a really interesting concept of I'm trying to remember who had put this out, this idea of diffuse power versus concentrated power. And we need to think about how do we use today's technology to harness diffuse power more effectively. And I do think that, we do see some, countervailing forces where, you are, for example, able to bring together lots of people around an issue and create more of a counterweight. But I don't think that it's strictly going to work in the old system. I mean, again, what we already see today is, public pressure is often more effective, and that public pressure may be, gathered through these same technologies that are also having all these negative effects. But they can sway public opinion. That public opinion then sways legislators or companies or whatever. And I do think, obviously, we see that is no panacea either, because it often sways them to do bad things as well as good things. And there's a future that we're heading into in which I believe we just have to get better at managing this world in which we are all connected, where we are able to create mind storms in the brains of other people, that are technologically amplified. And I do think that that's a super important thing. Everybody, like, if you look at the harms of Facebook, part of the harms are the harms that Facebook itself implements, but it also just gave a set of tools to a set of decentralized actors who are using them for ill. And we actually need more power for Facebook to regulate their system. And so there's a complex set of issues that we need to tease apart, like who's actually causing the harm
Yeah.
and why are they causing it?
Unfortunately, I've been told that we need to stop now. It's 7 p.m. in London. I did want to ask both of you maybe just to give us a quick sense, but if you have literally a 10-second version of, again, something interesting that you've seen, maybe Shoshana, especially with your focus right now on participation, on activism, on also campaigning, and, in some ways that actually together we're going to have to battle this out. It's not going to be just kind of everyone kind of doing their own thing. What is, have there just been any inspirational groups that you've worked with recently? I know that Francesca Bria, a common friend, again, who was actually the chief digital officer for the Barcelona mayor, recently has also been working in Europe around that whole need for much more democratic participation around this particular issue that you've been highlighting.
Well, I think here's where we are now. We are a young information civilization that has not yet found its footing in democracy. That's where we are now. And so in that sense, we can compare where we are now to the early phases of industrialization, where there were no workers' rights and there were no consumers' rights. And in both, without those charters of rights and the laws that sprang from them, both Europe and America would have looked forward to a very dark 20th century of oligarchy and serfdom. That's not what happened. The 20th century had its ups and downs, but overall, we did progress towards stable democracies, a rising middle class, prosperity, because we harnessed industrialization to democratic principles, values, and aspirations. That's where we are now. So in my view, as far as the activism piece, Mariana, our young people are ready. Our publics are ready. Not 100%, but to a greater degree than anyone thought imaginable, even a couple of years ago. And the pandemic has increased this rather than diluted it. So we now see majorities in the US in the 70th, 80th, and 90th percentiles saying that, these companies have too much power and we've got to rein them in and we don't trust them to do it themselves. What's missing now, and your question points to it, and it's a good rallying cry to end on, we need the channels to move between citizens and the indignity and frustration and even anger and outrage that we feel, to move between all of that energy and to channel it into collective action. Because we are in the realm of politics now, friends. Only politics will move us forward. And that inherently begins with collective action. It won't be the same shape that it took in the 20th century. It's not about trade unions and labor unions, because as I said before, it's not just the economic domain. It's the whole society now that is at risk. So whether you're forming a student group or a professional group or a community group or a neighborhood group, or however you want to define it, bringing people together to clarify your thinking, to get your lawmakers and grab their attention and begin working in collaboration with your representatives and elected officials. This is how we move forward. Democracy is not a mountain that's there when you're born and there when you die. It's a wheel that turns, and every generation is called to keep that wheel turning. Don't let it wobble. Don't let it fall. This is where we are now. We've done it before. We do it again. Democracy is the best idea that humanity has come up with so far. It's not going to die. We can't let it die.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Shoshana. It's truly inspirational. Tim, did you want to have just a closing sentence or two before I thank you both?
I would just say what Shoshana said with one additional thought, that democracy is not just about passing laws, passing regulations, getting it. It is about what we collectively believe. And I just want to return to that moral sense, because I do think that the moral sense, actually, the change in what we believe is right, is in a constant dialogue with how we capture that in our laws. And, you can see that in the progress, of various kinds of social movements. It's when people come to collectively believe that something should be so that the legislators get the courage to say, oh yeah, let's make it so, in the system. And so what we have to do is we have to have a kind of like, there is a moral order that we want to, of what we want to believe in. And that is what changes the world. The future calls to us, and it provides us challenges. And for example, you take climate change. When we collectively believe strongly enough that this, that we have to come up with a solution to it, that solution means that we must change how we operate, we will start to figure our way forward. But right now we're still in this, do we believe this or not? And you think about the origin of democracy. We decided in the United States that we weren't going to have a king, and it was the people came and decided that before they figured out the implementation of that. And so I think in that way we have to decide the future that we want.
You're absolutely right. And both of you have closed on really important points. Just one kind of small point I would say is, I'm Italian. Everyone thinks Italy is without rules, a bit of chaos. But actually, when we have strong rules, people actually change their behavior. So the kind of smoking ban miraculously worked in Italy from like the next day, no one was smoking, unlike other rules, like don't cross the zebra crossing. Oh, sorry, don't drive through the zebra crossing if people are walking through. That's never respected because the fines aren't there. And so when you take rules seriously, when you have a aligned way to actually enforce them, as well as obviously them being based on consensus of a better way of living, I think you need both. And the problem right now is we don't have strong rules. And we also perhaps, unfortunately, don't have enough consensus. And I think what's really interesting, Shoshana, is you're saying the youth are actually leading. And on that, just one thing is we never mentioned the word labor. And when we look at rents, one way you can also look at rents right now globally is the profit share of global GDP is actually at a record high. The labor share is a record low. And there's lots of talks of things like a just transition to make sure that workers are not kind of screwed over by the digital transition, the climate transition. But what's not often talked about is precisely what Shoshana was talking about, which is where's the voice of labor? Where's other types of voices even talking about what world do we want to live in? It's not just about kind of, ex post reacting to make sure that the distribution is fair, which of course it has to be. And that's one of the key problems there with the profit and labor share, but also new voices in terms of what we even mean by a digital economy, what we mean by a sustainable economy. So this is also going to be something we talk about, and this is my ending, next for the last session, which will be Tuesday, July 13th. It's going to be on the Green New Deal, and we'll be looking as much at the deal as the green bit with Rana Farouhar, a journalist from the FT who'll be chairing, and Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy for Climate Change, and myself. And so thank you so much, Tim and Shoshana, and all the people who joined us, including those who signed up but weren't able to join. And the good news is that this discussion will be on YouTube next week and on our website. So thank you very much. We went 8 minutes over, but it was all very much worth it.
Thanks so much.
Brava.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.